August 1831. In the humid lowlands of Cypress Hollow County, Virginia, between 2 in the morning and sunset on August 23rd, 55 people were found dead along a stretch of farmland, barely 16 miles wide. Men, women, and children, entire families vanished inside their own homes. The local paper refused to print their names. The courthouse sealed witness statements for half a century. When the state militia finally arrived, they killed more than twice as many people as the rebellion itself had claimed, most of them innocent. For over a century, Virginia history books would call it simply the Cypress Hollow event, a phrase meant to hide what really happened. But the truth was written in blood across the tobacco fields of Tidewater America, a truth that forced the country to face a question it had ignored since its birth. What happens when people who have nothing left to lose decide they'd rather die free than live enslaved? Before we go deeper into the story of Elias Carter, the man they later called the Prophet, and the uprising that turned the South to trembling, I need you to do something. If you're watching this from anywhere in the American South, Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, or Louisiana, drop a comment and tell me where you're from. This story is part of your history, whether your teachers told you or not. Subscribe, because what you're about to hear is a chapter of America that powerful people spent generations trying to bury. And it doesn't end how you think. The Virginia that Elias Carter was born into on October 4th, 1800 was built on contradictions. The man who had declared, "All men are created equal," only 24 years earlier, had personally owned hundreds of human beings. The same state that produced 4 of the first 5 U.S. presidents also contained one of the nation's largest enslaved populations. Nearly 500,000 people lived in bondage, and Cypress Hollow County, a small farming district near the Great Dismal Swamp, embodied that contradiction perfectly. It wasn't the brutal rice coast of South Carolina or the vast cotton fields of Mississippi. It was quieter, a place where slavery hid behind politeness and sermons, yet its wounds cut just as deep. By the 1820s, the tobacco-rich soil had begun to die. The big plantations were shrinking into smaller family farms. White landowners who couldn't afford to keep their enslaved workers began selling them south, to Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, tearing families apart and sending people into a hell from which few ever returned. The threat of being sold down the river hung over every enslaved man and woman like a shadow that never moved. In those days, the county's population was roughly 60% black, over 7,000 enslaved souls, nearly 2,000 free people of color, and a little more than 6,000 whites. The county seat, Millfield, was a sleepy town built around a courthouse, a tavern, and 3 churches. The landscape was flat, thick with pine woods, cut through by swamp streams and the winding Cypress River, a route that led straight into the wild, untamed Great Dismal Swamp, a place where runaways could vanish for weeks or years. Elias was born on the Carter farm, owned by Major Thomas Carter, a man known locally for his wealth and piety. His mother, Nancy, had come directly from Africa, and she passed to her son an unshakable hatred of chains. His father's name was lost to history. He escaped when Elias was still a boy, disappearing north and leaving behind a single legacy: the knowledge that freedom was possible, if you were willing to risk everything for it. From childhood, Elias was different. He learned to read and write, a dangerous rarity for an enslaved child in Virginia. The Carter family, perhaps amused by his curiosity or eager to show off a clever servant, allowed it at first. Elias devoured the Bible. He read by candlelight in the smokehouse, whispered psalms to himself while working in the fields. His intelligence was undeniable, and his faith ran deep. He had a gift for preaching, words that could stir hearts and silence a crowd. But more than that, he had visions. From an early age, he claimed that God spoke to him, that he could see signs in the sky, hear the voice of the Spirit in thunder. Neighbors began calling him the Prophet. When he was 21, he ran away, escaping the Carter farm and hiding for nearly a month in the swamps. For 30 days, he lived on berries and faith, breathing air that tasted like freedom. Then something happened that no one could explain. He came back. He walked straight up to Major Carter's son, Samuel Carter, and surrendered. He said God had told him he'd been chasing earthly freedom when he should have been preparing for heavenly deliverance. The other enslaved workers thought he was mad. Why would anyone return to chains? But Elias's visions grew stronger after that. In 1825, he said he saw lights dancing in the sky. In 1828, he claimed the Spirit spoke to him clearly. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. He began to see his life not as one man's struggle, but as prophecy, himself cast as a new Moses, called to lead his people out of Egypt. By 1830, he'd been sold again, this time to Joseph Travis, a carpenter who'd married into the Moore family, the legal owners of Elias. Travis wasn't cruel by the standards of his day. He didn't whip without reason and gave decent food. But decency doesn't soften a cage. Elias worked the fields and the workshop, waiting for a sign. His wife, Charity, and their 2 children had been sold to a nearby farmer, Giles Reese. He could sometimes see them from across the fields, but they belonged to another man. In February 1831, Reese's son used Elias's own boy as collateral for a gambling debt. That was the breaking point. Days later, an annular solar eclipse darkened the county. The sun transformed into a ring of fire. To Elias Carter, it was a black hand crossing the face of heaven. The sign had come. The Lord had spoken. The time for deliverance was near. For 6 months, he planned quietly. He spoke to no one he didn't trust. He chose 4 men, Hark, a giant of a man, Nelson, calm and steady, Henry, quick-witted and brave, and Sam, whose master lived near the Travis farm. They met in the woods by night, whispering over the sound of crickets. They understood the cost. What they were planning would almost certainly kill them. But some deaths mean more than a lifetime in chains. They planned to begin on July the 4th, 1831, Independence Day. The irony was deliberate. A message to a country built on freedom while living off bondage. But Elias fell sick, and the date passed. They waited. They watched the skies. On August 13th, another strange light appeared. The sun glowing bluish-green, an atmospheric effect later blamed on a distant volcanic eruption. To Elias, it was confirmation. The time had come. On the evening of Sunday, August 21st, they gathered deep in the woods near Cabin Pond. The heat was suffocating. Mosquitoes thick as fog. They roasted a pig, prayed, and swore oaths. 2 new men joined them. Jack, Hark's brother-in-law, and Will, a hired-out laborer known for his quiet fury. By midnight, they were ready. None of them could have known that within 48 hours, they would become the most feared men in Virginia, or that their rebellion would shake an entire nation awake. At around 2 in the morning on Monday, August 22nd, 1831, they moved through the mist toward the Travis farmhouse. The world was silent except for the insects and the low hum of frogs in the marsh. A ladder was placed against the side of the house, leading to a window on the upper floor. Elias climbed first. His hands were steady. The wood creaked softly under his weight. Inside, the air was thick with sleep and candle wax. He felt the boards beneath his bare feet and opened the door from within, letting the others slip silently into the darkness. The Travis family slept without fear. Joseph Travis, his wife Sarah Moore Travis, her young son from a previous marriage, and a baby in a cradle by the bed. They had never locked their doors. Why would they? For generations, the people who worked their land had been taught obedience, beaten into silence. But that night, obedience had died. Elias picked up a hatchet from the corner of the workshop and stepped into the bedroom. He raised it high, but his hand trembled. The blade missed its mark, striking sideways against Travis's head. He screamed. In that instant, Will, his face unreadable, stepped forward and swung his axe clean through. The room erupted in chaos, and within moments, silence returned. The Travis family was gone. They took guns from the walls, flintlock muskets, old hunting rifles, a sword that Elias would carry from that moment until the end. They took horses, food, and ammunition. Outside, under the pale gray of dawn, Elias drilled his men like soldiers, using the sword to signal formations he had seen in the white militias. It was almost surreal. Enslaved men moving in lines and ranks, practicing discipline they had never been allowed to have. One more man joined them there, Austin, another worker from the Travis farm who had overheard the whispers and decided to take the risk. Now they were 8. Their next stop was Silas Franklin's smallholding. Franklin was poor, owning only one enslaved man. They killed him before he could rise from bed. His enslaved worker fled into the trees, and they fired but missed. The rebellion spread with the sunrise. At each farm, the men faced the same decision: speed or certainty. They couldn't leave survivors who might raise the alarm, but they also couldn't afford to linger. Every minute counted. At the Reese farm, where Elias's wife and children lived, the group approached quietly. Charity was inside. He could see the smoke from her kitchen fire curling through the trees. For the briefest second, he stopped. He could have gone to her, taken his family, tried to flee. But he didn't. Whether he feared slowing them down or simply wanted to keep them safe from what was coming, no one will ever know. He turned away, his jaw set like stone. They killed Piety Reese and her son, wounded the overseer, and kept moving. As the sun climbed higher, more enslaved men joined. Some came willingly, their eyes blazing with conviction. Others hesitated, frozen between terror and hope. A few refused altogether. Elias never forced them. Freedom meant nothing if it wasn't chosen. Still, just being seen near him was dangerous enough. The rebellion had become a fire no one could put out. By mid-morning, the group reached Elizabeth Carter's plantation, a widow's farm surrounded by willows and fences. They struck quickly, killing her neighbor Mrs. Newman, and the overseer. Their numbers now neared 20. From there, the group split. Hark took 6 men on foot toward Henry Bird's homestead, while Elias led 9 mounted men toward the Whitehead property. That would become the bloodiest site of the uprising. Catherine Whitehead was a widow like many in that region. In her home lived her mother, her grown son Richard, 4 daughters, and a grandchild. The rebels reached the house while the family was still inside. There was no time for escape. When it was over, 8 people lay dead. Only one daughter, Margaret Whitehead, managed to flee into the fields. Elias himself chased her, his sword gleaming in the morning light. He caught her near the fence line and struck her down with a rail before finishing it. It would be the only person he personally killed during the entire rebellion. Later, he would confess that he'd done it not out of cruelty, but to show his men that he wouldn't ask them to do what he himself was unwilling to do. By noon, roughly 45 people had been killed across Cypress Hollow County. The rebels now numbered nearly 60, some on horseback, others barefoot and bloodstained, armed with muskets, axes, and farm tools. Their goal was Millfield, where they planned to seize the local armory. Once armed, they believed others would rise too, that the uprising would spread through Virginia and maybe farther. They would make their final stand, if needed, in the Great Dismal Swamp, a place where no white militia dared follow. But their secret had already begun to leak. A boy had escaped from one of the early farms and reached Millfield by noon, warning that the slaves are killing everyone. Panic rippled through the countryside. White families barricaded their doors. Riders galloped through the dirt roads, shouting alarms. The surprise that had made the rebels unstoppable now began to evaporate. Elias pressed his men forward. If we stop, he told them, we die as slaves. If we move, we die as men. By mid-afternoon, they reached James Parker's farm, just 3 miles from Millfield. There, for the first time, they met organized resistance. Parker and a small group of armed whites had set up a defensive line behind fences and wagons. When the rebels approached, the gunfire came fast. The first volley dropped 2 men. The rebels tried to return fire, but their old muskets were slow to reload. Panic spread. They fell back into the trees. Despite outnumbering the defenders, they had lost the advantage of fear. The whites fought like cornered animals, and the rebels broke formation, retreating toward the woods. Elias tried to rally them, shouting over the chaos, but the moment had turned. They regrouped near Ridley's plantation, still determined, but shaken. Some began to whisper that maybe God hadn't chosen the right time after all. That night the air hung heavy with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. They camped in a clearing, setting guards and praying under the same stars that had once given them hope. Elias told them the war wasn't over. The Lord's purpose doesn't fail, he said softly. Only men do. But by dawn, the camp was half empty. Fear had done what bullets could not. Some had fled back to their farms. Others vanished into the swamp. The rebellion that had burned so bright just hours earlier was already flickering. At sunrise on Tuesday, August 23rd, the remaining men, barely 40 now, made one final push. They moved toward Samuel Blount's plantation, believing it was deserted. But Blount and 5 armed men were waiting inside, rifles aimed from the windows. When the rebels approached, the volley tore through them. The survivors scattered in every direction. Horses screamed, men fell, and in the chaos, Elias was thrown from his mount. He rolled into a ditch, crawled into the thicket, and disappeared. In less than 48 hours, the largest slave uprising in Virginia's history was over. The rebellion had begun in faith and fury, but it ended in smoke and silence. Those who weren't killed were hunted through the woods like wild game, and the vengeance that followed would be even bloodier than the rebellion itself. When news of the uprising reached neighboring counties, fear spread faster than the flames of any fire. Within days, thousands of armed white men poured into Cypress Hollow. Local militias, farmers with rifles, soldiers from across Virginia and even North Carolina, all converged on the county. The number of armed men soon exceeded the entire white population of the region. They came not for justice but for vengeance, and vengeance never asks for names. The newspapers in Richmond and Norfolk called it an insurrection of demons. The editorials demanded swift punishment, no trials, no mercy. And that's what they got. From sunrise to sunset, armed mobs swept through farms and forests, dragging black men, women, and children into the roads. Anyone suspected of knowing Elias Carter, or simply being in the wrong place, was shot, hanged, or beaten to death. Entire families were wiped out for no reason other than fear. A reporter from the Richmond Gazette wrote later that the white retribution was hardly inferior in barbarity to the original atrocity. But his words never made it into most editions. His editor removed them before print. Even then, truth was dangerous. Some militia companies treated it like a hunt. They rode through the pine woods laughing, rifles across their saddles, shooting at any shadow that moved. One unit from North Carolina killed 40 black people in a single afternoon, then looted the bodies for coins and watches. Their captain later scolded them, not for murder, but for stealing property that belonged to white men. The rage was that blind, that cruel. Within a week, over 100 black people were dead. Some were rebels. Most were not. A few had actually hidden white families in their attics during the rebellion, but the mobs didn't care. They killed them anyway. They needed blood, and blood was easy to find. Meanwhile, Elias Carter was gone. Vanished like a ghost into the woods he knew better than anyone. For 10 weeks, as thousands scoured the swamps, he never left Cypress Hollow County. He stayed within miles of the farm where it had all begun, hiding in places only a man born in those fields could have found. His first hiding place was a fallen pine. Its enormous roots had pulled up a disk of earth 6 feet across, creating a hollow beneath. He'd widened it with his bare hands, lined it with pine needles, and covered the entrance with branches. Unless you were standing directly on top of it, you'd never know it was there. That's where he stayed for 6 weeks, 6 weeks, in darkness, in heat that made the air feel like boiling water. He couldn't light a candle. The smoke would give him away. He listened to the world through layers of soil and roots, the shouts of search parties, the barking of dogs, the gunshots that echoed through the trees when a militia thought they'd found someone. At night, when the patrols finally rested, he would crawl out just far enough to drink from a small stream nearby, then retreat before sunrise. Food came from people who risked their own lives to feed him, enslaved men and women from nearby farms, maybe even free black residents who dared to move through the woods after dark. They'd leave cornbread wrapped in cloth beneath certain trees, or bury sweet potatoes in shallow holes marked with stones. Court records later mentioned a woman, unnamed, from the vicinity, suspected of helping him. She was never charged. Maybe they couldn't prove it, or maybe the local whites simply didn't want to admit that mercy had existed among the enslaved. What went through Elias's mind during those weeks is impossible to know. He had time to think about the men who died for his cause, about the families burned out of their homes, about his wife Charity and his children, who'd been tortured for information. He must have known that innocent people were being killed because of what he'd begun. But he didn't surrender. He believed that his mission hadn't failed. It had merely begun. By mid-September, the county was in chaos. No one slept. White families barricaded their houses at night, weapons within arm's reach. Women refused to be alone in their homes. Children were told not to look servants in the eye. Even church services became scenes of suspicion, every black face in the pews a potential traitor, every whispered prayer a possible plot. Governor John Floyd in Richmond received daily reports. His letters from that time, later uncovered, revealed a man unraveling. He couldn't comprehend that enslaved people could organize something like this without white influence. It had to be Northern abolitionists, he insisted. Someone had to have taught them. He urged new laws, harsher controls, tighter patrols. Fear turned to policy. In late September, the search began to slow. The militias went home. The state troops returned to their posts. The fields, once echoing with gunfire, went quiet again. But Elias was still out there. His supplies were nearly gone, and the woman, or women, who had been feeding him could no longer risk it. He decided to move. For the next 2 weeks, he lived like a shadow. He traveled only at night, avoiding roads, crossing fields barefoot to muffle his steps. He listened from the edges of farms, overhearing conversations, learning what had become of the rebellion. He discovered that nearly all his followers were dead or captured, that trials were being held in Millfield. He also learned how the whites talked about what they'd done. Some bragged about killing 20 in one morning, laughing as though it was sport. Others justified it as divine retribution. Elias heard it all and said nothing, only moved on silently through the dark. He could have fled north. The underground routes were dangerous but possible. He could read, he knew the stars, and he understood the terrain. Many others had escaped before him, but he didn't go. Whether it was pride, faith, or simply exhaustion, he stayed. Some say he still believed God had more work for him to do. Others believe he couldn't abandon the people who had died for his vision. By early October, he had found a new hiding place, a depression under another fallen tree, this one on the property of a man named Peter Edwards, less than a mile from where the uprising had begun. It was a place already searched several times, which made it safer. He dug deeper, enough to sit upright. He gathered roots and plants to eat and prepared to wait again. But time was no longer his ally. On the morning of October 30th, a farmer named Benjamin Phipps was walking his property with a shotgun, as every man in the county did now. He noticed something strange near his fence line, a patch of ground that looked disturbed, branches laid too carefully. He approached, cautious. The earth shifted, and from beneath the tree, a pair of eyes appeared. "Come out," Phipps said, his voice shaking. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then Elias Carter rose slowly from the hole, thin as a ghost, his skin streaked with dirt and sweat. His clothes hung in tatters. His face was hollow, but his gaze was steady. Phipps later said he looked neither afraid nor surprised, almost as if he'd been waiting for this. "Are you Elias Carter?" Phipps asked. Elias nodded once. He didn't run. He didn't beg. He simply asked, "How many of my men are still alive?" When Phipps told him most were dead, he said nothing more. That afternoon, word of the capture swept through Cypress Hollow like thunder. Crowds gathered outside Phipps's house, demanding to see him, to hang him, to tear him apart. But Phipps refused. He locked Elias in a shed and stood guard himself. Whether it was decency or pride, no one knows. The next morning, he turned him over to the sheriff of Millfield, and the man who had terrified Virginia for 10 weeks was marched in chains down the dirt road toward the county jail. The road to Millfield was lined with faces. Men, women, and even children came from miles around just to catch a glimpse of the captured rebel. Some cursed, some spat, others stood silent, staring at him like he was some creature from another world. Elias walked barefoot between soldiers, his wrists bound, his steps steady. The morning light fell across his torn clothes, his ribs visible beneath his skin. To those watching, he was both terrifying and pitiful. A man who had once brought the South to its knees, now just another prisoner marching toward judgment. By the time they reached the small brick jail near the courthouse, the crowd had swelled into hundreds. The sheriff shoved him into a narrow cell, 8 feet long, 10 wide, with one barred window and a heavy wooden door. Outside, guards kept watch around the clock, but inside that cell, Elias Carter was calm. He prayed aloud. He quoted scripture to anyone who would listen, and when no one did, he murmured it to himself, as if the words themselves were company. Within days, Word of his capture reached a local attorney named Thomas Graydon, a young man with more ambition than reputation. He saw opportunity in the prophet's downfall. If he could convince Elias to tell his story, to confess everything, he could publish it and make himself famous. He convinced the jailers to grant him access, arguing that the state needed a written account of the insurrection's cause. What he wanted, though, was profit. Graydon sat with Elias over several days recording their conversations. He asked about the visions, the planning, the killings. Elias spoke quietly, never raising his voice, describing each event with eerie precision. Graydon later wrote that he seemed perfectly composed, even cheerful, his mind clear and his purpose unshaken. When Graydon asked if he regretted what he'd done, Elias looked at him for a long moment before saying, "I only regret that freedom had to come through blood." The document that resulted, the Confessions of Elias Carter, would become one of the most infamous texts in American history. Graydon claimed it was word-for-word transcription, but historians would forever debate how much of it belonged to him. Some phrases carried Elias's unmistakable rhythm and biblical tone. Others sounded like Graydon's embellishment, crafted to make the rebel seem mad or possessed. But one thing was clear: Elias believed he had acted on divine instruction. He said the Spirit had shown him signs in the heavens and commanded him to strike. "The first shall be last," he repeated, "and the last shall be first." Graydon's manuscript portrayed Elias as both prophet and murderer, a man convinced that God himself had chosen him to bring judgment upon the oppressors. The more Graydon wrote, the more fascinated he became. The man sitting across from him didn't fit the caricature of savagery printed in the newspapers. He was intelligent, articulate, even gentle in demeanor. Graydon couldn't decide whether he was insane or inspired. Either way, he knew the public would pay to find out. Elias's trial was scheduled for November 5th, 1831, less than a week after his capture. The courthouse in Millfield overflowed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, climbing onto benches and windowsills just to see him. The judges, there was no jury, sat grim-faced. The charge was conspiring to rebel and committing insurrection. The punishment was already known. Still, the ritual had to be performed. His court-appointed attorney, James French, barely spoke. What could he say? His client had confessed. The evidence was overwhelming. The crowd demanded blood, not justice. When asked if he had anything to say in his defense, Elias replied simply, "I did what was commanded of me." There were no tears, no pleas, no apologies. Just conviction. The judges took less than an hour to deliberate. The verdict was guilty. The sentence, death by hanging, was to be carried out in 6 days on November 11th. Elias didn't flinch when he heard it. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. Some said he smiled. In the days that followed, people came from across Virginia to see him. They bribed the guards for a glimpse through the bars. Ministers came to save his soul, urging him to repent, to denounce the voices that had guided him. He listened politely, then shook his head. "Was not Moses called by a voice in the wilderness?" he asked one preacher. "Was not Christ slain for speaking truth?" The minister left in tears. Graydon visited again, hoping to draw out final words for his book. Elias obliged, describing how the sun's eclipse had convinced him the time had come. "The heavens spoke," he said. "Men are deaf who will not hear." Graydon tried to challenge him, but Elias only smiled faintly. "You will write what they will pay to read," he told the lawyer. "But they will not bury me. Not truly." On the morning of November 11th, the crowd began gathering at dawn. Farmers hitched their wagons to see the spectacle. Mothers brought their sons, telling them to remember what happens to those who rise against their betters. The gallows stood near the courthouse, simple wood beams and a rope swaying gently in the cold wind. By noon, more than 1,000 people filled the square. Elias was led from his cell, his wrists chained but his back straight. The guards offered him a blindfold. He refused. The hangman, a deputy named Edward Butts, adjusted the noose. A preacher read a final passage from Scripture. "For all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword." Elias listened, then spoke his last words. "Was not Christ crucified?" The trapdoor opened. The crowd gasped. His neck snapped cleanly. He died instantly, his body swinging in the midday sun. They left him hanging for an hour, as was customary, then cut him down. But death was not enough for the mob. What happened next was uglier than anything that had come before. Under the pretense of medical study, local doctors dissected his body. His skin was flayed and tanned into keepsakes. His skull was passed from hand to hand for generations. No grave marked his name. No prayer was said. They wanted to erase him, to turn him from a man into a warning. But in doing so, they created a legend. The fear that had gripped Virginia after the uprising deepened after his death. Parents told children ghost stories about Elias the prophet, who rose from the swamp to haunt the wicked. Churches preached sermons about obedience and divine order. And in the State House in Richmond, lawmakers began drafting the harshest laws Virginia had ever seen. Laws designed to make sure no other Elias Carter would ever rise again. But the truth, like a seed buried in dark soil, doesn't die easily. And what grew from that blood-soaked earth would reshape the South forever. In the weeks following Elias Carter's execution, Virginia tried to breathe again. But the air had changed. The rebellion had left a scar that would never heal, a wound both physical and psychological. White families who had once believed their slaves loved them like family could no longer sleep without pistols under their pillows. Every knock at the door after sunset made hearts leap. Every rustle in the field could be the beginning of another night of terror. The state legislature in Richmond moved quickly. Within months, a new wave of laws was written, not to bring justice, but to tighten chains. The lawmakers said it was for public safety. Everyone knew better. They were building a cage around fear itself. The first law struck at the heart of what had made Elias dangerous: literacy. No enslaved person in Virginia was ever again to be taught to read or write. Teaching one would bring a fine, prison, or worse. A literate slave, they said, was a thinking slave, and a thinking slave was a threat. Free black men and women were also forbidden to hold schools or even teach Sunday lessons, unless a white supervisor was present. Knowledge had become contraband. Next came the laws on assembly. Any gathering of more than 5 enslaved people, even for prayer, required a white person to be present. It didn't matter if it was church, a funeral, or a wedding. The law claimed to prevent plotting, but everyone knew what it really did. It stripped black people of the only safe spaces they had left. The independent church meetings that had once been small sanctuaries were crushed overnight. Preachers were jailed, congregations broken up by patrols. The songs that had once filled the pine woods on Sunday evenings fell silent, except for the sound of the whip. Movement was next. No more traveling with simple passes signed by masters. Now every enslaved person leaving a property needed documents stating exactly where they were going, why, and when they'd return. Anyone found without proper papers could be whipped on the spot or sold for correction. White men on horseback, patrollers. They called themselves, rode through the night with lanterns, stopping anyone dark-skinned they met, checking papers and often beating them anyway. They were supposed to protect order. They became the law's most vicious instrument. Even the free black people, those who had lived their entire lives outside bondage, found their freedom turning to dust. Suddenly they could no longer testify in court, own guns, or gather in public without permission. Some were forced to carry certificates of freedom at all times, as though liberty itself required proof. Property deeds were challenged, businesses shut down, and those who protested were told to leave the state for their own safety. Hundreds did. Families that had lived in Virginia for generations sold their homes and fled north or across the ocean to Liberia, a colony that had been created just for this purpose: to send free black Americans somewhere white society didn't have to look at them. In small towns like Millfield, the new laws didn't just change policy, they changed hearts. Trust evaporated. Where once enslaved women had nursed their masters' children, now mothers pulled their babies close, unwilling to let them out of their sight. In the fields, overseers began carrying pistols instead of whips. At night, white families barred their doors, while enslaved men and women huddled in their cabins, whispering prayers that no one would overhear. Elias Carter's rebellion had not freed a single person. But it had freed something else, the truth that white Southerners had spent centuries trying to deny. It proved that the people they enslaved did not love them, did not accept bondage as their destiny. It proved that they were angry, that they remembered every lash, every family torn apart, every promise of freedom broken. That knowledge terrified the South far more than the rebellion itself. In Richmond, Governor Floyd received reports of unrest from across the state. He responded by ordering the creation of permanent armed patrols in every county. Preventative vigilance, he called it. What it meant was that every road became a checkpoint, every plantation a fortress. The South had become a police state. The psychological shift ran deeper still. The old lie of paternalism, that slavery was a gentle moral system where masters cared for their servants like children, was dead. If even the most kind slaveholder, like Joseph Travis, could be murdered in his bed, then kindness no longer seemed a protection. Fear replaced affection. Where love had once been feigned, suspicion took root. The rebellion had turned the entire social order upside down. Slave traders capitalized on that fear. Planters in Virginia, terrified by how many enslaved people they outnumbered, began selling them farther south in record numbers. Ships and wagons filled with men, women, and children rolled toward the deep South, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, where cotton was king and cruelty was legend. The slave markets of Richmond, once bustling but contained, became crowded beyond belief. Families who had lived together for generations were ripped apart in days. The phrase, "sold down the river," entered the language as a kind of death sentence. Economically, it made sense. Virginia's worn-out soil couldn't sustain its old plantations. Selling human beings became its most profitable export. Between 1831 and 1840, tens of thousands were marched south in chains. The rebellion had accelerated an industry of suffering. But among white lawmakers, fear also took on a new form: ideology. Before Elias Carter, many Southerners had called slavery a necessary evil, unfortunate, but essential to the economy. After him, they began calling it a positive good. Ministers preached from pulpits that slavery was part of God's design. Politicians thundered that black people were inherently inferior, that bondage was their natural state. Scientists wrote absurd theories about different species of man. They needed to believe these lies, because the alternative, that the enslaved were just as human as they were, was unbearable. By 1832, Virginia's House of Delegates held a rare public debate on the future of slavery. Some members, shaken by the bloodshed, proposed gradual emancipation. Others argued it was impossible, that freeing the slaves would mean inviting another massacre. In that chamber for weeks, men who had grown up believing themselves masters faced the moral reckoning of what they'd built. The name Elias Carter echoed through the debates like a curse. One delegate said, "If this is what comes from their chains, what would come from their liberty?" When the votes were counted, emancipation failed by just 15 votes. 15 men had decided the future of millions, and with that, the last serious chance for Virginia to end slavery peacefully died. The door that might have opened stayed shut for 3 more decades, until a war forced it open in blood. But that war began here, in the humid fields of Cypress Hollow County, in a rebellion that lasted 48 hours and changed the conscience of a nation. Time has a way of turning blood into story, and story into myth. But in the years after Elias Carter's rebellion, the line between truth and legend was nearly impossible to find. What he had done, what his men had done, was burned into the Southern mind like a brand. For the enslaved, his name became a whisper of hope. For the white South, it became a synonym for terror. Children grew up hearing his story told in 2 completely different ways. In the cabins under the moonlight, old women told it like a prophecy, that one day another Elias would come, and this time the chains would truly break. But in white households, his name was spoken only in warning. "Behave," mothers whispered to their children, "or Elias will come for you in the night." He was no longer a man but a haunting, a shadow that crept through the swamps when the wind blew just right. In Richmond, preachers thundered from pulpits that the rebellion had been the work of the devil himself. "Satan spoke through that man," one minister shouted to his congregation. But others, especially those in the North, saw something else. Elias Carter's uprising made headlines across the country. In New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, abolitionists seized upon it as proof that slavery was not just immoral, it was unsustainable. William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator called the rebellion a divine thunderclap against the nation's sin. Southern newspapers demanded his arrest for sedition. The divide between North and South, already deep, became a canyon. Northerners began to speak more boldly about immediate emancipation. Southerners answered by doubling their defenses. The language hardened. Each side claimed God was on its side, and somewhere between those shouts, the truth of what had actually happened in Cypress Hollow faded into noise. In the black communities of the North, Elias Carter became a symbol, not of violence but of courage. Abolitionist speakers invoked his name in secret meetings, not to glorify the killings, but to remind listeners that the human spirit could not be caged forever. They said he was not a monster, but a man who had done what desperate men do when the world leaves them no other path. In 1833, when the American Anti-Slavery Society was founded, one of its members read from a newspaper clipping describing the rebellion's aftermath. He asked the audience a simple question. Who is the greater sinner, the man who kills for freedom, or the man who kills to keep him chained? There was no answer. There never would be. Meanwhile, in Virginia, the memory of the rebellion was treated like a plague. Public officials avoided even mentioning it in speeches. Churches prayed for the souls of the victims, but never for the cause. Families who had lost loved ones during those 48 hours built their own mythology, telling tales of how loyal slaves had saved them from death. Some of those stories were true. Many were not. Memory became defense. The South needed to believe that most of its enslaved people had remained faithful, that Elias Carter was an exception, not a warning. But the enslaved knew better. They carried the story differently. They sang it. In workfields and river docks, in whispered hymns and coded songs, fragments of his story appeared. Never his name, but his spirit. A line in a spiritual might sound innocent. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? But those who knew the truth heard another meaning. Deliverance didn't just mean salvation, it meant uprising. Years passed. New generations grew, and the rebellion slipped from memory in public, but lived underground in private. Some said that in the swamps of Cypress Hollow, lights could still be seen at night, flickering like lanterns, moving where no men walked. Elias's ghosts, people said. The superstitions masked a quiet truth. Hundreds of runaways had used those same woods as shelter on their way north. The routes that Elias's men once marched had become arteries of escape. By the 1840s, those routes were part of something larger, the Underground Railroad. Many of its conductors were said to keep small tokens, symbols of remembrance, a coin marked with the letter E, or a scrap of cloth said to have belonged to one of the rebels. Whether these stories were real or imagined hardly mattered. What mattered was belief. Elias Carter had become a mythic figure of resistance, a southern Moses whose promised land was freedom, even if he never reached it himself. Yet to the white South, the legend served another purpose entirely. Planters used it to justify every new cruelty. When a law was too harsh, they said, "Remember Carter." When an overseer killed a man for disobedience, they said, "We can't risk another rebellion." Every injustice found its excuse in that name. It became both prophecy and prison. Even the press, decades later, couldn't leave him alone. In 1849, a Richmond editor reprinted excerpts from Graydon's Confessions of Elias Carter as part of a study in fanaticism. He claimed it proved that religion made enslaved people dangerous, that letting them read the Bible planted rebellion in their hearts. He was partly right, but for all the wrong reasons. The Bible had given Elias not madness, but meaning, the belief that a higher justice existed beyond his masters. That belief, once sparked, could never be extinguished. Meanwhile, in Boston, abolitionist lecturers read the same book to packed halls as evidence of America's hypocrisy. They read his words not as warning but as prophecy. "Was not Christ crucified?" he had asked before the rope tightened. That line became a refrain in anti-slavery sermons. To them, Elias Carter was not a criminal. He was a martyr in a war that had not yet begun. The tension between those two versions of his story, the demon and the deliverer, defined the American conscience for a generation. The South built walls of fear. The North built pulpits of outrage. Neither could forget him. He had forced the nation to see itself. By 1850, a new Fugitive Slave Act made the entire country complicit. Even free states were required to return escaped slaves. For many Northerners, it was too much. The memory of Elias Carter, his rebellion, his death, his words, took on new power. "He died for liberty," said one abolitionist newspaper. "Let his ghost walk among us until every chain is broken." The irony was cruel. The man who had once been hunted like an animal had become the spirit haunting the conscience of a nation. His uprising had failed in every earthly sense. His men were dead, his cause crushed. But its echoes reached further than he could have imagined. From pulpits to parlors, from plantations to printing presses, America couldn't stop talking about him. In 1859, when John Brown led his own rebellion at Harper's Ferry, the newspapers compared him immediately to Elias Carter. "Another madman prophet," they sneered. But Brown himself had read the confessions. He kept a copy in his trunk. Before his own execution, he quoted the same verse, "Let the oppressed go free." History, it seemed, was repeating itself, not as rumor, but as revelation. And so, as the storm of civil war gathered on the horizon, the story of the most feared slave in Virginia, who had murdered 55 people in 48 hours, became more than history. It became a warning and a mirror, showing America what it had done and what it still refused to face. When the Civil War finally came, 30 years after the rebellion in Cypress Hollow, Virginia became its battleground and its graveyard. The same fields that had once run red during Elias Carter's uprising now shook with cannon fire and the thunder of armies. Soldiers in blue and gray marched across the land where he had preached freedom, most of them never knowing his name. But whether they knew it or not, they were fighting in the world he had prophesied. For the South, the war was about states' rights. For the North, it was about preserving the Union. But for millions of enslaved people, it was something simpler and far holier. It was the war Elias had spoken of in whispers and visions. It was the war to end slavery. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, word spread slowly through plantations and army camps, carried by rumor, song, and faith. And somewhere in a cabin or a field, someone must have whispered, Elias was right. By 1865, when the guns finally fell silent and the Confederacy lay in ruins, Virginia's rivers ran black with soot and ash. The old plantation houses stood empty, their owners fled or dead. The same soil that had grown tobacco and cotton now held the bones of a generation. Freedom had come, but at a cost far greater than anyone could have imagined. The survivors of slavery stepped into a new world that did not know what to do with them. Some took new names, choosing to erase the ones their masters had given. Others kept their old ones as proof of endurance. Many went searching for lost husbands, wives, and children sold years before. And in those early days of freedom, Elias Carter's name rose again, not as a warning, but as a whisper of pride. His rebellion became a story told in freedmen's schools, in church basements, in the oral histories that would one day become gospel. But the South, humiliated and bitter, wanted to forget. The men who had rebuilt their power under new names, redeemers, they called themselves, passed laws that looked eerily familiar. Sharecropping replaced chains, and Jim Crow replaced the overseer. They burned Elias Carter's name from their records, erased it from textbooks, and pretended that the rebellion had been nothing more than a local disturbance. They wanted the story buried deeper than the man himself. Yet history has a stubborn way of rising. In 1867, an old woman in Cypress Hollow told a northern journalist about the rebellion. She had been a child then, hiding under a table while the screams echoed outside. She said that when she grew older, she realized something. Elias had been both monster and miracle. He made them see us, she said softly. They never saw us before him. Not really. Her words were printed in a small abolitionist paper in Philadelphia, and from there the legend began to take root again. Over the next century, his name resurfaced in the strangest places. In the Harlem Renaissance, poets wrote verses about him, never using his full name, just the prophet in the fields. During the Civil Rights Movement, preachers invoked his courage in sermons about justice. Elias walked so that we might march, one minister said in Selma, his voice trembling with fire. And in classrooms, where history was finally being retold by those who had lived its shadow, his story returned, not as a tale of terror, but of truth. Still, even in modern times, his memory divides. Some see him as a hero of resistance, a man who rose up against impossible cruelty. Others call him a murderer, haunted by the blood of innocence. And perhaps both are true. The line between justice and vengeance has never been clean. But history rarely gives us saints. It gives us men like Elias Carter, flawed, furious, faithful to something greater than themselves. What cannot be denied is the echo of what he started. Every movement that came after, the abolitionists, the freedom riders, the protesters marching through tear gas, carried a fragment of his defiance. Each time a people stood against oppression, each time a voice rose where silence was expected, the spirit of Elias walked among them. Even in Cypress Hollow, where time has softened the land but not the memory, the story refuses to die. The old plantations are gone now, replaced by highways and suburbs. But deep in the woods, near a stream that still cuts through the marshland, there is a patch of ground where nothing grows quite right. Locals say that's where he hid, the fallen pine that sheltered him through 10 weeks of fear and faith. Hunters sometimes leave offerings there, a coin, a prayer, a scrap of cloth. No one admits to it, but someone always does. On quiet nights, when the mist rolls in from the river, the air feels heavy with something ancient. The frogs fall silent, the wind pauses, and for a heartbeat the whole forest seems to hold its breath. Some say that if you listen closely, you can hear a voice in the dark, calm, steady, certain, whispering scripture. Others swear they've seen a flicker of light between the trees, moving slow and sure, like a man carrying a lantern through eternity. The scholars and historians will tell you Elias Carter was just a man. A preacher, a slave, a murderer, a visionary. They'll give you dates and documents, trials and confessions, the numbers of the dead. They'll remind you that the rebellion lasted only 48 hours, that it failed, that it changed nothing in its time. But history is not measured in hours. It's measured in what refuses to be forgotten. For nearly 2 centuries, America has tried to decide what to make of him. Some still call him the most feared slave in Virginia, the man who murdered 55 people in 2 days. Others call him the first man to remind a nation that freedom, once imagined, can never again be silenced. And maybe both are right. Maybe that's the point. Elias Carter didn't live to see the world he dreamed of. He died with a rope around his neck and a prayer on his lips. But his story didn't die with him. It moved through the generations like a pulse, faint but unbroken, whispering that justice, no matter how long denied, will always find its way back to the surface, even now. When the night settles heavy over the Virginia hills and the moonlight touches the old swamp where he hid, the air still carries that echo, soft, defiant, eternal. It says, freedom never dies. It only waits, and in that silence, Elias Carter lives on,